Welcome to Fearless Finances, where I try to take the fear out of your finances. Something really interesting happened in one of my economics classes this week. While we were in the middle of this discussion, one gentleman in the class said, "Well, Renee, what do you think would build a good economy?" And I gave him the political correct version that I normally would in class because I want them to arrive at their own conclusions. I present the information, I present the facts, and I want them to arrive at their own conclusions. I don't believe it's my place to tell them what they should think. And he pressed a little further. He said, "Renee, you've been at this a lot longer than we have, and you've done a lot more of the research. So I would really like to know what you really think." And then I laid it out square. We need to tax the rich. We need to give more benefits to the middle class. We need to go back to FDR when there was money available through the Federal Housing Administration for homes, when we had better health care. We need health care. We need to fix health care. And I went on. I also offered up the proof of how well the FDR economy worked. Now, granted, by 1950, FDR wasn't around anymore. But the reality is the 1950s was the most prosperous economy in US history. And much of it was due to these investments in the middle class. And by the way, the maximum tax rate was 90% on the wealthy. Yes. They went further and asked me what I considered the wealthy to be. And I said $24 million or more in income and more than $1 billion in assets. I think that's pretty fair, don't you? And I think we could get rid of a number of the loopholes. I persuaded them with my case and facts. Because after all, who wouldn't want a more prosperous America? And then he said this, "But Renee, what about the debt? What about the US national debt?" And this is the thing. A lot of people make a big deal about the debt. But I've been around here a long time, and I've seen lots of presidential candidates come and go. And it seems to me that usually the Republicans, as they're trying to get elected, they make a big deal about the debt. They're still making a big deal about the debt, but they don't want to tax the rich. They want us to give up more benefits. Interesting how that works. But I've never seen any real problems come from the debt. Have you personally ever suffered any sort of negative consequence directly from the national debt? I teach lots of people in my classes, and no one has been able to say definitively, yes, and then give me some sort of example. Now, if you have one, I'd love to hear it because I try to deal with facts and truth always. So note it in the comments if you have one. But I want to show you today a video that we watch in a lot of our classes. It's from CNBC, and it includes a number of economists talking about the national debt. And I think it's important to put it in the perspective that this video offers us. Because right now, the rich and the Republicans are trying to tell us that we need to sacrifice more because we need to get a handle on this debt. And please don't get me wrong. I think we should be fiscally responsible, but we need to start making investments in the middle class. Before we take a peek at that CNBC video that I mentioned, I want to share with you a Time magazine article. As you can see, this is entitled, "The Top 1% of Americans Have Taken 50 trillion from the bottom 90%. And this happened over the last 50 years, essentially since Ronald Reagan was in office and convinced us that trickle-down was something that might actually work. This is an article that's done by Mr. Nick Hanauer. He's a billionaire who advocates for more social fairness in our economic system. He recognizes as a billionaire that they'll actually have more wealth if they share more with us. Amazing. Anyway, I point this out to you for one very simple reason. Our tax system and many of the laws that we've had in place have essentially moved this wealth. This has been done by reducing the tax rates to the rich and shifting that tax burden to the middle class. At the end of this video, I'm going to link up 2 other videos that I've done on both of these issues, and one of them features Nick Hanauer's TED Talk. It's awesome. Some of the comments I've received have alluded to the fact that a lot of people don't seem to realize how gross, and I don't mean gross as like it's rude and crude. I mean gross in the magnitude of it, how gross the wealth inequality is. Essentially, how over the years, over the decades, the rich have gotten richer and the rest of us have moved further back. But let's jump into that MSNBC expanded news segment on the national debt. Do me a favor. As we go through this, please note who your favorite economist is, and I'll tell you who I like the best.
The thing that we refer to as the national debt is really nothing more than an accounting record. It's keeping track of how many dollars the government has added to the broader economy, minus how many dollars it has subtracted away from us, mostly through taxation.
Is there a reason you should want debt to be zero, precisely zero? No, there's no reason for that. Debt has many useful purposes.
But many economists and politicians warn that the ever-expanding national debt can be harmful to the economy.
We have to think about the growth rate in our economy. If the growth rate is faster than the interest rate, then that makes that debt more sustainable.
The U.S. economy certainly has the resources to pay down the debt over time, or at least to stop the increase in debt. But we need political action for that to happen.
So why can't the U.S. get a handle on its national debt? And does it even have to?
Before we keep going on, I want to talk to you about this paying off debt. In fact, that's going to be my next national debt video. Andrew Jackson paid off the debt, and it's the only time in U.S. history that the debt has been paid off. Other than that, we've always held some measure of debt. And in all that time, we've created one of the most prosperous economies ever. And in fact, I'm going to roll that back and take off the qualifier. Not just one of the most prosperous economies, but the U.S. economy is the most prosperous economy ever. More than the Roman Empire, bigger than Babylon. Any economy ever does not compete with what the United States has ended up producing. And in all that time, except for a few short years, we've had debt on the books. Back to the video.
The majority of the U.S. debt is held by the public in the form of government securities, such as treasury bonds, notes, and bills.
When the government borrows money, it does that by issuing a bond, which is a piece of paper that either says, I owe you this much money in the future, or I'm going to pay you interest at these particular time horizons.
Government is giving us the ability to trade in some of the dollars that it has supplied for a different kind of U.S. dollar called a government security.
The U.S. dollar represents the reserve currency for the world, so lots of people want to own our treasuries.
Treasury debt is considered an extraordinarily safe, secure asset, and somebody who's looking for a safe, secure asset would naturally be attracted to buy U.S. government bonds.
Point 1, I love how she talks about the debt. And when I refer to she, this is who I'm referring to. This woman right here. And it's hard to see in this picture, but she literally has a book behind her that I'm pretty sure she authored called The Deficit Myth. She's just saying that the bonds that are issued are a different type of monetary system. And right now with the Trump tariffs, we've seen how the trust that other governments have in our currency and in our securities is paramount. What Trump has been doing has mixed up people's confidence in our ability to offer security. And one of the things that has made us so wealthy is the security that we've offered. And part of that security is the fact that we have laws and that we operate within those laws. Trump is breaking that entire system. I think it's also important to note because they gave us gross numbers of securities that are issued. This is the US debt clock. I don't use this in my classes as much as I used to. I have found a few inaccuracies on it. And as a result, I don't necessarily trust the information like I used to. However, there's a lot of great financial information here, and hopefully we can count it as factual. The national debt, as you can see here, is 37 trillion, just about. But what I really want to call your attention to is this number that's down here. Now, I'm going to blow this up a little bit so that you might see this a little bit better. And there you go. It's a number that says US debt held by foreign countries. I've been showing this resource and this number to my classes for quite literally decades. And this number has never exceeded 10 trillion. In fact, even when our national debt was 15 trillion, this number would have been 6 or 7. How many here watching this right now have ever heard we're at risk because China owns most of our debt? Well, that's simply not the case. Right now, it stands at about a third. Now, granted, part of what stopped Trump from doing his full tariffs was what started happening in the bond market. People were selling the security that other countries felt they had and other people felt they had with the US dollar and with US securities was getting broken. And as a result, that finally caused Trump to stop. I'm hoping other things cause him to stop because we're going to have a little bit of a financial mess if he keeps going forward. That's not what this video is about. Let's get back to the other video.
So public debt has always been used for emergencies. It's easier to finance by borrowing than to burden the current generation with taxes. We saw debt rise dramatically in the late 2000s after the global financial crisis, and we saw debt rise again during COVID. That debt, in some ways, is a contingency plan that we use to smooth out otherwise what would be big shocks to our economy.
The problem is that we keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing day in and day out. So we're not borrowing for emergencies. We're not borrowing for only for long-term investments. We're borrowing for immediate consumption. And any borrower, whether that's a person or a business or a government, if you borrow for immediate consumption with no long-term benefit, you're actually deteriorating your financial or fiscal future over the long run.
I think it's really important to stop at that point. And when you watch some of the other national debt videos that I have available, I drive this point home over and over again. If we are taking on debt to educate the people, to build infrastructure, to do research, to help the environment stay more healthy, to even expand certain businesses like the microchip that Biden had passed. All of these things then are helpful into the future. It's really no different than if you're a business owner or doing your personal finances and you decide to educate yourself or take out a loan for a small business or even for your home, right? Even a remodel to your home where it will increase the value. Are you with me? But if we take on debt to give rich people another tax break, that's not a wise investment. But when those same billionaires are currying favor with our representatives so that they can get more tax breaks, which is equaling pretty close our national debt, and then we're told we need to give up the things that actually help make investments in us, research, education, medical care, infrastructure, it makes absolutely no sense. And we need to dispel these myths. And the people who are buying into it are the people who are less likely to be able to afford the buy-in. So back to the video.
What's really critical here is what they call debt to GDP ratio. That is your debt to the size of your economy. We're almost at 100% debt to GDP.
By the way, important to note, we're past 100% now. We're actually at about 125. Google it if you like. It might be different by the time you're watching this. Back to the video.
An economy the size of the US, usually a stability number is around 70%.
I also want you to know this. When she says a stability number is around 70%, we don't know that. It's a little bit like trade deficits. How people sometimes make a big deal about trade deficits, and there's economists that do. But we've never really seen any ill effects from them. And some of these numbers need to really be reworked. And what I mean by that is this. When Trump sat there with his lovely little tariff sign, it didn't include services or research. And that is what the United States exports the most of. It only has tangible goods, which we might export some of, but we don't do a lot of. So a lot of these numbers need to be reconsidered. A little bit like this GDP to debt ratio. They came up with this 70%. You're going to find as we move through this that a lot of countries have blown past that, well past that, and are doing fine. So when someone says something like this, what it really is more of a theory than a fact. In fact, one might even argue that the whole GDP in and of itself is another value that should be reevaluated. Consider that in another video.
Is looking at that ratio important because it really shows whether you can service that debt.
Servicing the debt means paying back the debt and the interest on the amount to the lender.
The reason interest rates matter is because the government has to pay interest on its past debt. And as interest rates rise, those net interest payments start increasing dramatically.
The Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rates since March 2022 with the goal of slowing down economic activity.
When you raise interest rates, you have to pay more to service the debt. You can't do the national programs we need to do without incurring even more debt.
The federal government paid $475 billion in interest on the national debt in 2022. That's nearly 2% of GDP.
The Fed is pushing up interest rates, and this is feeding hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in additional income to bondholders. So people who are holding government bonds, paying higher rates of interest, are getting a huge windfall.
Debt helps your economy because so you can take on large initiatives like infrastructure. You can take on crises like the pandemic. But you have to watch where your debt to GDP ratio is because that really is the stability indicator of whether you can actually service this debt or whether you're tilting the balance.
Again, we don't know that. I mean, certainly 70% sounds lovely. But again, we're going to see lots of countries that have exceeded that.
The public debt is one thing we're going to pass to the next generation. So is the quality of the environment. So is the infrastructure and roads and broadband and etc. So we need to balance both, the costs and benefits that we send to future generations.
I love how they talked about the environment and all of those other things too. Because under Biden, he was making investments in all of that. Trump stopped it. I don't know about you. And you can decide this for yourself. But I'd like to leave my kids a legacy of a planet that is doing well and will take care of them and that they can continue to take care of. And honestly, when people keep trying to get richer and richer when they already seem to have enough and taking it from the planet and other people, it just seems gross. And now I mean the other gross. But back to the video.
Biggest point of confusion or piece of misinformation about this thing we call the national debt is that it is somehow a burden to the rest of us, right? You'll hear people talk about the national debt burdening future generations. It ends up scaring people because you're thinking that the federal government's budget works like a household budget, and that if the government is borrowing and taking on debt, that somehow it's going to find itself in a situation somewhere down the road where it can no longer afford to pay the bills. And that's just simply not true. The government's budget doesn't work anything like a household budget.
I love her. Pick your favorite person and note it in the comments. But she's my favorite.
Isn't the only country with debt. There are 15 other countries with higher debt to GDP ratios than the US, with Japan having the largest in the world. Economist Stephanie Kelton says Japan's economic situation illustrates why debt isn't as harmful as mainstream economists suggest it is.
The Japanese government has been running fiscal deficits basically for the last 3 decades. Has it been inflationary? No. Has it driven interest rates sky high and crowded out private investment? No. Has Japan faced any kind of a fiscal solvency crisis as a result? No. When you look at what mainstream economics tells us is supposed to happen, if governments don't balance their budgets, if they run persistent fiscal deficits, if the debt continues to rise, interest rates are supposed to go up, it's supposed to trigger inflationary problems, solvency risk, and all the rest of it just didn't happen.
We don't know what the counterfactual is. We don't know how much faster the Japanese economy would have grown had they not been saddled with so much public debt.
The U.S. national debt tends to make headlines alongside words like default and debt ceiling.
A default is any time the government does not make a payment that it promised to make.
We're one of 2 countries, I think, on the planet that has this sort of a debt ceiling in place. The other is Denmark, and they set it so high that it never really becomes an issue for them. Here, the debt ceiling limit is a self-imposed constraint. It's something that Congress put in place. Congress is given 2 sets of instructions to the executive branch. Congress is saying, spend this money that we have authorized, these programs in this budget, but don't issue any more of this specific type of security in order to facilitate that payment. So it kind of leaves the executive branch in a position where it's got to find a way to continue to spend because it's authorized under the law to spend, but not spend in the way that it normally would.
I wish we could get rid of the entire debt ceiling issue. It's totally unnecessary in the first place because the government can't spend money unless Congress authorizes it anyway.
The fight over the debt ceiling can have serious consequences for the U.S. and the global economy.
At this stage of the game in my classes, and it's normally not associated with this video, but it is in the class that I teach that we look at this video. And that is the difference between the budget and the debt ceiling limit. These are 2 different pieces of legislation. Now, in a lot of my classes, I just ask the group, and most people get it right. They get it right because they remember people being on the news in front of a microphone, continuing to tell people, hey, we're trying to pass this budget bill, and those Republicans or those Democrats, right? And we might hit the debt ceiling, and the U.S. Treasury Secretary is on the news going, well, if we hit this, we can't pay our bills anymore because we don't have a way to do it, right? So we know that these are 2 different pieces of legislation, and I hope it didn't happen too fast in this video, but we are one of only 2 nations of the world that still have a debt ceiling limit. And we're going to hit ours this year. And what's ironic about having it is Congress already passed the budget. And by the way, this is why what Trump is doing is illegal when he's stopping just payments and departments and all this Doge stuff, because it's Congress's responsibility to appropriate it. This is the other thing that we talk about in class. And then the executive branch pays it out. That the executive is to duly follow the laws. And Congress passed the budget, the law, a president signed it, and now the executive with the U.S. Treasury is to just simply pay it out. If the executive does not like the budget, you pass a new one. That is how we do this legally. There's also something called the Impoundment Act. This was passed after Nixon had been in office and tried to do all this illegal shenanigans as well. So, right now, the Republicans in the House and in the Senate are trying to come up with a budget bill. And Trump has also put forward a budget that he would like to see them do. This budget that Trump would like cuts a lot of services to the American people and makes our defense budget over $1 trillion. Anything that might have been saved by firing all of these employees and every other thing that they did, which, by the way, did not save the federal government very much, but will cost us as American people dearly. The Republicans in the House and the Senate, they want to basically do the same, but they're having a hard time being able to do this and not add an additional $4 trillion to the national debt because they still want their billionaires to have a major tax cut. Before getting back to the video, I want to make one other point. Many times Republicans that I hear talking out there will say, so you want everyone to have a tax increase. I don't know how we go from let's have the rich pay their fair share to so you want everyone to have a tax increase. It's always some extreme or another. Like when you say, I would like the people who were shipped off to a prison in El Salvador to be able to come back for their due process. The response from the Republican side is, so you want people who break the law here? No, I didn't say that. We don't even know if they broke the law because they didn't have due process. So there's absolutely no reason that we could not consider a tax increase to the rich and even a tax reduction to the middle class. But back to the video.
Fitch, one of the bond rating services, lowered the U.S. credit rating in early August 2023 from the top category to a slightly lower one.
It was a combination of three things. One is the rising debt to GDP ratio in the current forecast. The second is the lack of an explicit plan to deal with that. And third is the kind of terrible governance that Congress demonstrated in the debt limit buildup that occurred a few months ago, with many congressional Republicans threatening default if their demands were not met.
As of December 2022, about $7.4 trillion of U.S. debt is held by foreign governments or investors, which makes up 30% of publicly held debt.
It's always nice when the other data matches the other data. This means we know we're in fact world. Like we're in the real world where the truth matters.
Why would we care about the stock of debt held by foreigners? The reason is that when we think about how a debt crisis could emerge, it's much like a banking crisis. One day we wake up and we no longer believe an entity is solvent. And so we run, right? We run for the exits. That sort of behavioral response is very similar, just playing out at an international level when we have debt crises.
That's what Donald J. almost caused. Back to the video.
That foreigners run for the exits where they're seeing there's no agreement in the US over fiscal policy, and the debt to GDP ratio keeps ratcheting up and interest rates are slowly getting higher, making it harder for the US to pay off that existing debt. So those kinds of signals could, lead some to begin to sell U.S. treasuries.
Ultimately, the U.S. national debt isn't getting paid off anytime soon.
People are, at the abstract level, in favor of cutting the deficit. The problem is, at the implementation level, they oppose spending cuts that would affect them, and they favor tax increases that would affect them.
Important to note, one of the reasons that it isn't always a good idea to cut back spending too much or to use too many financial resources to pay off the debt is this slows the economy. Like the Republicans might sit back and maybe it's true and maybe it's not. I don't know. But let's just say they do want to cut Social Security and they want to cut how much money Americans receive through Social Security. Just as an example, all those dollars that get issued to seniors under that program and family members of somebody who's deceased, right, go out into the economy in the form of purchases. And especially when it's something like Social Security, the vast majority of recipients, not all, but actually use that money to live on to some degree. This is important to their household income. So it literally goes into the economy and helps foster small businesses and other economic resources. You cannot take a chainsaw, a literal chainsaw. He just went around and whacked things around and canceled things that they didn't like. Ah, so frustrating. But you really can't pay this off or even reduce spending to such a degree that it can have enormous economic impact. The same holds true to just flipping a switch and going back to a 90% tax rate on the rich. And what if we did like 10% of all your assets? Because that's what Elizabeth Warren had, not 10%. I kind of liked her plan. I think it was a half a penny. If you have X amount of wealth or more, you pay a half a penny tax. So, because many of them don't get income, right? They borrow money to live on. Anyway, I digress. If we had this enormous tax burden on their wealth, the rich, and we said, we want you to pay 10%, we're going to help pay off this debt, da 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 da. What happens? Well, point one, they try to get out of it. But let's say they all just started to pay their 10% tax. They have to sell stocks, real estate, a whole bunch of things to come up with the cash to do it. And then what happens to the value of these things? Are you with me? Because now we have a great big sell off, right? And who's going to buy all these assets? And now, if we use it to just pay off the debt, that means that there's other monies out in the marketplace that now needs a place to have it invested. Are you with me? All of this needs to be done strategically and with forethought. And with that in mind, when Andrew Jackson paid off the debt, what do you think likely happened? I think you should note it in the comments below. And then look out for that video that I'm going to do about Andrew Jackson paying off the debt, because I got to tell you, he's a lot like Donald J. Did you know that? I think he did. Well, there isn't too much of the video left. We pretty much got it all covered, and I hope you got something out of it. If you did, I'd love you to list a comment below. And if you also would, please subscribe. I'm working really hard to build up this channel, and you can help me by subscribing and liking this video. And also, if you think this was helpful to you, somebody else might think it's helpful too, so share it if you would. And as promised, I've got 2 videos for you right there. One of them features Scott Galloway, where we talk about how the billionaires built the national debt. And I give you even more information that's super helpful. And then the other one has Nick Hanauer, where we talk about a better form of capitalism. I hope to see you there.